for joining us today for Supporting Human Development and Sexual Health in Health and Physical Education webinar. My name is Kristen Burfeld, and I'm a project leader here with OPHEA. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. Please note that there is a chat room in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen in the Adobe Connect room that you can use to ask questions and respond to chat questions throughout the webinar. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar for any questions we don't get to during the session. So please do put them in there and we will make note of them. And anything we don't get to during the webinar today will be part of a follow-up recap blog that we will be developing. We invite you to stand and move around throughout the webinar. And we also encourage you to follow along in the 2019 Elementary Health and Physical Education curriculum in the link that we'll be putting in the chat box. Today we will be hearing from Alyx Duffy and Tanya Woods, who will be sharing information on Strand D, Healthy Living, which includes human development and sexual health. This is part of a larger webinar series to support the implementation of health and physical education. Alyx Duffy is a genderqueer equity educator based in Toronto with over a decade of experience in equity work focusing on 2SLGBTQI, safer schools and communities. A founding member of Challenge Accepted, a community-centered equity and inclusive collective, they work to educate and encourage everyone to consider how to make community safer and more inclusive for each and every dynamic individual. Alyx uses they, them, and their pronouns and asks others to use these pronouns in reference to them. Tanya Woods is an instructional program leader for K-8 in health and physical education with the Halton District School Board and also sits on the Ontario Association for the Support of Physical and Health Educators, otherwise known as OASPE, executive. She completed her Bachelor of Kinesiology at McMaster University and her Bachelor of Education at Queen's University. Tanya has worked for the Halton District School Board as an elementary health and physical educator for 16 years and an instructional program leader for the last 5 years. In her current role, she is responsible for all professional development related to the elementary health and physical education curriculum, elementary athletics, safety, well-being, and outdoor experiential education. Tanya uses she, her, and hers pronouns and asks others to use these pronouns in reference to her. And we will be hearing from Tanya first today. Welcome, Tanya.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. Before we get started, we just kind of want to get a sense of who's joining us today. So I believe you will see a poll that's going to be coming up on your screen shortly. If you can just take a second to check off who is on the webinar. Just want an idea of where everyone's coming from. So lots of support for educators with the delivery of teaching the curriculum. A lot teaching their own. So mainly what I can see here is that there's mainly it's supporting educators with delivery or teaching of the curriculum, which is great to see that. So hopefully over the next number of slides, we can help you guys to be a little bit more supporting in your roles. So our learning objectives for the hour that we're going to be together is to have a clearer understanding of human development and sexual health components of Strand D, Healthy Living in the 2019 Elementary Health and Physical Education curriculum. To feel more confident and comfortable implementing key concepts within human development and sexual health, including gender identity and gender expression to support the implementation of the 2019 Elementary Health and Physical Education curriculum, and to have an increased awareness of additional resources and further supports of credible information to support the implementation of the curriculum. So in a nutshell, basically, what do you need to know and what supports are out there for you to help support your students with this new curriculum? Before we dive into some curriculum expectations, we'd like to get a sense of how knowledgeable you are feeling about the topic of human development and sexual health. So if you could just click on the screen, you can see the poll that's put up on there. So nice to see that we're looking at some confidence with it to a great deal of confidence, which is nice to see that there is some knowledge out there about teaching the human development and sexual health portion. Okay, so just as a quick overview of what's been updated, we just want to take a moment to highlight some of the updates in the 2019 curriculum. And you can see from the picture that is on your screen that Strand A on the left-hand side of the chart is social emotional learning skills. And we know that the social emotional learning skills are embedded throughout the entire curriculum. And we are going to be highlighting them with regards to some of the expectations that we will be talking about today within Strand D of Healthy Living. So some of the specific updates to Strand D, Healthy Living, are included in this slide. In particular, there are new body image expectations found throughout all grades. The addition of sexually explicit media, including pornography, in grade 6, and the legal age of consent in grade 7. Today we'll be focusing in on a few of the specific expectations from the human development and sexual health topic. But that said, it is important to remember that although we are addressing 3 specific expectations throughout this webinar, when we evaluate for healthy living, we're always looking at the overall expectation for the strand. Please feel free at any time to write questions in the chat box on the side, and we'll do our best to answer them as we move through the webinar. So the first expectation that we're going to be looking at, we're actually going to be looking at expectations from each of the divisions. So we'll look at one from the primary, one from junior, and one from intermediate. And we're going to explore some potential strategies for program planning and or assessment for that expectation. And we always encourage you to share additional ideas and or comments in the chat throughout throughout the webinar. So please feel free to add. We're going to start with the primary division, specifically looking at grade 2 curriculum expectations from Strand D, Healthy Living, Human Development, and Sexual Health. And it's important to note in the expectation that the social emotional learning skills are tagged at the end of each expectation. And what we're hoping to see is throughout is how we can connect each of these social emotional learning skills to the different activities that we're going to be looking at. So for grade 2, we're going to be looking at demonstrate the ability to identify and appreciate aspects of how their bodies work and describe what they can do to ensure that they will continue to appreciate their bodies as they grow and change. And you will, as I give some examples throughout the webinar, I'll be referring to the White Ribbon Drawing the Line resource, which has helpful information for educators around the age of consent. Since the legal age of consent is not exactly straightforward, there are close-in age rules which need to be properly explained to students, and drawing the line can really help support these conversations. So you can see in the chat that Kristen has added the link to the Drawing the Line on Sexual Violence, a guide for Ontario educators for grades 1 to 8. And I really encourage you to take a look at this resource. There's a lot of great stuff in there, and we'll be referring to some of the activities from Drawing the Line. So for grade 2, in this visual here, there's a number of activities that we can look at doing for grade 2 students. I'm going to focus in on one called I See, I Think, and I Wonder. And this is just one way that we could address this expectation. So looking at listing major body parts and placing them on chart paper around the room. So hands, legs, head, shoulders, etc. Having students maybe rotate around the room and brainstorm what they can do. So for example, my legs can walk, they can help me ride a bike, they can help me swim, etc. And then show the students a picture of the Ill Abilities Dance Crew. And the Ill Abilities Dance Crew is the picture that is up on the right side of your screen. Ill Abilities is, it doesn't refer to being sick or unwell, but rather to incredible, amazing, intricate talent. So rather than looking at negative limitations of disability, this crew actually focuses on their positive or their ill abilities. So just having them take a look at the picture and asking students to do an I see, I think, and I wonder. So what can they get out of the picture just by seeing it? And then following that, Kristen's just put a link in the chat. There's a great video of these folks actually dancing, and you can It really changes perspective when you see the video. So have students watch that video and then connect back to the list of what body parts can do and ask, and see whether the picture and video have changed anything for them. Would they add anything to that list? This activity connects directly to A1.3, so it's looking at emotions and motivation, as students are encouraged to persevere regardless of their ability. So the Ill Abilities group promotes a sense of optimism and hope for students that they can achieve anything they put their minds to. Over the next few slides, we're going to be talking a little bit about consent. So a couple of the expectations that we're looking at for junior and for intermediate focus a little bit more in on consent. It is important for all our learners to understand the concept of consent, including our younger students, students with modified expectations, as well as our students with special needs. And consent can be found throughout the curriculum document. However, today we're just going to be addressing specific expectations from grades 6 and 7. So in the chat, if you could maybe just pop in some examples of what are some ways that you might include the topic of consent in your classroom. And when you're writing in there, consider how you might address the topic for students with special needs. I'll give you a couple minutes to think about that and see some. There's multiple people typing, so I'm just waiting for some of them to pop up here. Healthy relationships and boundaries for relationships. So videos to introduce a topic, class rules by showing respect to our friends, building that circle of trust. So looking at social media and about consent and permission with regards to posting, including social media education. So including consent while talking about healthy relationships. And it looks like we have another video that's been posted on consent. So that's great. Lots of great ideas in there. So the specific expectation that we are going to be looking at is D2.6 from grade 6. And in here, we're looking at making informed decisions that demonstrate respect for themselves and others, and an understanding of the concept of consent to help build healthier relationships using a variety of social emotional learning skills. So number of social emotional learning skills being targeted down at the bottom, emotions, relationships, self, and thinking. So I saw a number of people post about consent using the T video. There's some great pieces that you can use using that video for sure. On the screen, you'll see the Drawing the Line on Sexual Violence, which is the link that Kristen had posted earlier. And then Consent for Kids is a great video that also addresses consent in sort of a using caricatures. This one, the activity we're going to talk about, or that I'm going to talk you through, is from the Drawing the Line resource. And it's called Don't Touch Me. It's on page 45 to 55 of the resource. In this activity, it's looking at using a KWRL chart with students. So leading them in a classroom discussion on what personal space and boundaries mean to them, asking students to complete the what they know and what they want to know area of their chart as the discussion progresses. And then inviting students to share their responses with the class. So lots of discussion with the students around the idea of consent and what they want to know. Moving then into having two different mind maps on the board and putting up an unwanted touch and then another one with the title of wanted touch, and leading a classroom discussion using some of the following questions. What does it feel like to receive a hug from someone you know and like? Is this a wanted or an unwanted touch? What does it feel like to receive a hug from someone you know but do not like? Is this a wanted or unwanted touch? And are there times when you would prefer not to be hugged by a person you know and like? So as you move through the discussion, record your student responses on the appropriate mind map, and explain to students that they have a right to their personal space and to decide what they do with their own body. Then we showed the Consent for Kids video that's linked in here. So Kristen did put the Consent for Kids link in the right-hand side there in the chat group for you. And lead a classroom discussion about the themes that the work presented. So ensuring that students understand the following key ideas, that they are in control of their body, that they are in charge of their body, and that if something happens that doesn't feel right, that they should tell an adult they trust. And extending on some of this, we might have students, as a culminating type activity, create some poems or chants on the topic of personal space. And if you take a look at the activity in drawing the line, it goes into a little bit more detail than what I've given you here, but it's a really, the discussion piece with students around that idea of consent and knowing that they are in control and in charge of their body is really key. The activities for consent really allow students to think critically about consent, and then also looking at making decisions to build healthy relationships. So, you know, we're looking at a lot of those social emotional learning skills that are being connected throughout the activity. So the second expectation that we are going to address from grade 6 is D1.3, so demonstrate an understanding of the impact of viewing sexually explicit media, including pornography. And this is a new link, or a new expectation this year in the 2019 curriculum. So we are going to be I want you to keep in mind that teacher and student prompts are also available throughout the curriculum document to help support with the understanding of the expectations. So if you're following along and you're looking through the curriculum document, you can see what some of the teacher prompts and what some of the student answers are. And it's not to say that you have to use them exactly as they are, but it can help maybe frame some questioning for your classes. So again, Draw the Line offers a lot of great activities around setting classroom norms, as well as a number of other activities. We're going to focus in on an activity that we came up with around body image and sexuality, and it's called Picture Word Induction, so PWI. So in this type of an activity, we might divide our class into small groups and maybe give them sticky notes. And then within each group, provide some images, including sexually explicit images of, like from media or magazine. And what would have students do is consider what the ad is telling us about bodies and body image. So students will become mindful of the message in the ad and consider what it is really telling us. And they might think about them as stereotyped or distorted or unrealistic, and need to consider how this might impact someone's sense of belonging. So without talking, students are going to look at the ad and think to themselves about what they are viewing and write what they see on the sticky and place it directly on the picture. So some examples of things that we might see would be things like we might write muscular or thin or perfect or no fat or perfect body. So a lot of these distorted body images that students might have, especially in the media. And then at each table, they would have 2 to 3 minutes and then rotate to another picture with their sticky notes. And we're doing this all sort of quietly. They're not talking, so they can look at, they can just kind of think to themselves at this point. Once they've been around all the tables, we'd be looking at putting all the photos up front and having the students almost do a bit of a gallery walk to see what everyone else has written, and then turn to a partner and just have sort of a discussion around what their thoughts are on some of the things that they might have seen. And then a whole class discussion around it. And having that guided discussion with students as well around, you know, what type of a meaning do you get from these? How might it promote harmful gender stereotypes? Who might be disadvantaged by the messages presented in the ads? Do sexually explicit ads normalize the use of pornography? You know, why do companies use these techniques? So giving students a little bit more of a guided a guided discussion so that you can have that talk with them. Addressing sexually explicit media, including pornography, can obviously be very tricky at times, and especially with regards to the legal aspect. I know that in our board, we're encouraged to connect with our elementary liaison officers around the legalities of pornography or human trafficking or things like that. So I think every board might be different that way, but I know that in Halton we're very much encouraged to connect with our elementary school liaison officers. So this expectation, D1.3, and I'll just flip back here, it doesn't actually have any SELs directly tagged to the expectation. In the chat, let us know what SELs you feel might be directly connected to either the activity I presented or anything else that you may have done in your grade 6 classroom around looking at sexually explicit media, including pornography. So just noticing some of the questions or some of the comments in the chat. Definitely keeping in mind that everything is age appropriate in terms of what we want to be sharing with students. So in terms of consulting parents, I think that there's definitely got to be a bit of a line in terms of what type of media images we are sharing with them, definitely. So having intergrade classes or split grade classes can always present us a bit of a problem. So I'd probably look at just a variety of different types of media images that you're using that are, again, that age and stage appropriate for what we can, what you would feel comfortable using in the classroom. The last one we're going to address, and just for sake of time, I know that we want to give Alyx time to, for his part. This is the last expectation that we're going to be looking at, and this is a grade 7 expectation. So explaining the importance of having a shared understanding with a partner about the following: delaying sexual activity until they are older, so choosing to abstain from any genital contact, choosing to abstain from vaginal or anal intercourse, choosing to abstain from oral genital contact, the reasons for not engaging in sexual activity, the concept of consent, the legal age of consent and how consent is communicated, and in general, the need to communicate clearly with each other when making decisions about sexual activity in a healthy, loving relationship. So a pretty heavy expectation to be looking at. Lots of different things that we could be doing with this one. Consent and tea was brought up earlier in the chat, and I think that there's some great activities that you could potentially do around consent and tea. Another activity as an icebreaker type activity could be a 4 corners type activity where we are introducing some of the different topics. So placing these 4 headings in 4 corners of a room. So we're looking at agree, disagree, yes, but, and no, but. And then having teachers read statements such as the following. So consent means you are respecting the other person's boundaries. Saying no can be communicated in different ways, such as body language. Intermediate students should be allowed to date freely. If I am in a relationship, that means sex. Oral sex is not sex. Sex is only for when we are married. Once you have sex, you can't practice abstinence. So reading out these statements, and as you read out each statement one by one, have students think about what heading best represents how they feel. So again, we want to encourage that discussion with them. And they would move to the corner with the heading and then take turns in that corner discussing their thoughts on why they chose this spot with another student. And then after a few minutes, maybe ask them to share before moving on to the next statement. So we're connecting a lot of social emotional learning skills here. We're looking at that emotion piece. We're looking at healthy relationships and how it's connected to consent, critically thinking about what we would or wouldn't do or how we feel about a certain topic. So it'd be a great icebreaker type activity that you could do with students in grade 7. Again, Drawing a Line has some great activities around consent for grade 7s, and I would encourage you again to check out that resource. And now we're moving on to Alyx.
Thanks, Tanya. Hi, folks. My name is Alyx Duffy, and I'm an equity and inclusion educator. I should also say that I'm your co-pilot for this next section of the webinar. We're going to go on a slightly deeper dive into understanding gender identity and gender expression in the context of this revised H&PE curriculum. We're going to work through a couple of different key concepts to get a solid understanding of gender identity and gender expression, and then we'll explore some ways in which those ideas are kind of woven throughout the fabric of the update to this curriculum. I should also say that a part of my work has been supporting students and educators in creating safer and inclusive school spaces for 2S LGBTQI students for about the last decade or so. And if you're wondering about that acronym, 2S LGBTQI, I'll be mentioning it a little bit over the next few minutes. It includes identities like two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, questioning, and many more. So we're going to talk more about those identities in a few minutes, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up on that. The first thing that I wanted to share with you is this image here from Trans Student Educational Resources. You might have seen a number of similar resources out there, and they range from a whole bunch of different pieces, including gingerbread people that you might have come across. There's astronaut versions. There's a ton. And the idea behind this resource is to really give us a moment to recognize the different elements of identity that can inform things like attraction as well as gender identity and expression. And a lot of these actually go way beyond the words that we might use to identify ourselves to the basic kind of feelings and concepts that we have about ourselves. So you can see on this image, we've got these sort of 5 different rows broken down here, starting at the top of gender identity, then going to gender expression, sex as it's assigned at birth, physical attraction, and emotional attraction. And we're going to speak a little bit about those pieces in a moment. But this resource and the other ones that are like it give you a fun and engaging way to get students involved in conversations around identity and explore some of the ideas and some of the experiences that we associate with gender and attraction identities. So we're going to come back to this stuff in a moment, but the piece that I'd like you to remember right now is that when we're speaking about these different categories, it can be sometimes useful to think about these different categories of identity as distinct, even if we might experience them as really similar or overlapping at different points in our lives. So to get that started, the first piece that I wanted to think about was this idea of gender identity that we're going to dig into a little bit today. And I'm guessing between all sort of 60 of us on this webinar right now that we could put together a pretty decent definition of gender identity. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the sort of simplest ways that you might define gender identity? Can you put something into the chat that kind of simply defines that? And as you're doing that, I'm going to try and move my microphone around a bit because I understand it sounds a little bit choppy for folks. Hopefully that's a little better. I see a couple different people writing into the chat right now, so I'll wait for some of that to pop up. We have some people noting the deeply held belief about who we are inside. That sounds good. Gender identity is what you feel, kind of how you feel your gender. It can be about expressing who we are in some ways in relation to our gender, how we feel on the inside, how a person sees themselves, understands themselves as maybe male, female, neither, both. A personal sense of one's own gender, how it can be described and how we feel it inside and out. The idea of gender being between one's ears, as opposed to that idea of sex being between one's legs, and we can talk about that more in a few minutes. Yeah, there's lots of different pieces around how we identify ourselves and others. So thank you for all those different excellent definitions. If we're looking for that kind of official definition, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has one that's featured in the H&PE curriculum document in the glossary section that's at the end. And that's from their policy on preventing discrimination because of gender identity and gender expression. And that definition reads that gender identity is each person's internal and individual experience of gender. It can be their sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along a gender spectrum. A person's gender identity may be the same as or different from their birth-assigned sex, and people may see their gender identity as fluid and moving between different genders at different times. So this definition is a fantastic one, but it's really just kind of the beginning of this discussion around gender identity, and there are so many other ways of considering this. So one way that I wanted to offer you today is to think a little bit about the difference between gender identity and another category of assigned sex. So if we look at the right side of this particular chart, we see gender identity, which focuses on who an individual is and how they identify themselves in relation to ideas around gender. And this is rooted in all the ways that we can experience gender in our bodies, right? We can think about the felt senses that come through our nervous system, our 5 senses. We can think about our own conception of ourselves, as well as our emotional experience of ourselves and that embodied sense. There's really many ways that we can experience gender identity. On the left side of this chart, we can also see a category for assigned sex. And this is sometimes referred to as sex on different government or official forms, and it refers to the medical or biological designations that exist, like female, male, and sometimes intersex. You know, sex as assigned at birth is often assigned by medical professionals like doctors, nurses, doulas, or midwives, and most importantly, it's based on a categorization of the medical understanding of our body's anatomy, really. So specifically what's often being looked at there are these pieces of information like chromosomes, or hormones, external genitals, or internal organs. It's important to note here that some people might be assigned female at birth, others might be assigned male at birth, but then not everyone will be fitting into these 2 categories. And in fact, that 3rd category of intersex acts as a kind of umbrella category to refer to what is quite a large variety of configurations that aren't easily fitted into those medical boxes of male or female. So for instance, someone might be labeled as intersex if they're born with a vagina, but have internal testes, a 3rd chromosome perhaps, like XXY, and are producing higher levels of the hormone testosterone than a medical professional might expect. We don't have a lot of time today to go into kind of the incredible diversity that exists when we think about this category of biological sex, but it's safe to say that it goes way beyond simply having 2 options. And so we're going to come back to that as we think a little bit around how to be inclusive of intersex identities in further discussions. However, what I wanted you to think about here is some of these different examples of gender identity and how they differ in our understanding of things like assigned sex. So to get a little bit of a clearer understanding of some of the identities that exist, here we have some gender identity language. And if I read that out from left to right, we have examples of identities like agender, or trans, or genderqueer, woman, questioning, two-spirit, cisgender, and man. The reality, there's a ton of gender identity language that exists in English, and there's so much more out there in other languages. Gender diverse identities have been around as long as there have been human beings on this planet, and so we can find many different cultural traditions around the world that have long established traditions of maybe 3 gender systems, or 4 gender systems, or possibly more. The real key to understanding gender identity is that it's about our own understanding of our gender, and not necessarily about how other people perceive us. So with that understanding, we can jump to think a little bit about gender expression. And it's very simple in some ways to think about gender expression in similar or on a similar line. So we can look at that as how a person publicly presents or expresses their gender. That can include behavior and outward appearance. But if we think about that a little further, we can think about all the different ways that we express gender. And so I wanted to ask you, can you think about some of the different ways that people might express gender using their bodies? So for instance, I imagine getting ready for work this morning, some of you might have considered gender expression, consciously or not, using something like clothing. And so we see an example here of folks in the chat sharing that choice of clothing as an example. Potentially tattoos can also be one way of expressing gender. So if you've got an idea, I would encourage you to share it in the chat now. We've got things like accessories, absolutely, and jewelry has been mentioned. We can think about makeup as another piece, appearance, haircut, and hair color. We can also think about movement and maybe how we move, how we take up space, how our movements are seen as being conservative or aggressive. We can think about tone of voice. We can think about so many different pieces here. I'm seeing more hair and clothing and makeup and body language and movement. There's so many different pieces, and it looks like a lot of you are very much on the same page as we were when we were thinking about this. Thank you all so much for adding some of those ideas to the chat. It looks like we've touched on almost everything up here so far. we thought about clothing and makeup and body modification. We thought about accessories and jewelry, and name was another piece that came up in the chat. Hair, and we're talking about hair on the body, but also hair on the head. We can think about our stance, how we take up space, our gait, how we walk, all these different pieces, including our voice and even our pronouns, which we can come back to and talk about a little bit later. So thank you so much for all of these different fantastic examples. Now, someone shared a really good important point in the chat, that it's important not to make assumptions, and this is the next piece that I was hoping to chat about when we think about gender expression and self-concept a little bit here. So I often think that when we think about gender expression, it's useful to sometimes think about art. If you think about an art activity in your classroom, for instance, maybe students are working on putting together a picture, painting a picture, and someone presents you with the picture, and you look at it and you say, wow, that's a beautiful velociraptor. What a great dinosaur you made there. And the student frowns and replies, it's supposed to be a picture of you. On the one hand, you have an artist who is making something, and they're putting it out into the world. And on the other hand, you have the world interpreting that entirely based on their own understanding, based on their own frame of reference. And it's really often similar with gender. I often feel like I am, an artist, and I'm putting together my masterpiece, and then I share it with the rest of the world, and often people just don't get it. The key thing I'm getting across here is that I think we can't actually know how someone identifies their gender simply because we see or experience them expressing it in a particular way. There's so much that can get lost in that communication between, the artist and the viewer, so to speak. Maybe we grew up in different cultural time periods that have different ideas of what gender expressions mean. Or maybe we're from different cultural backgrounds, and one culture doesn't even have a category for a gender that another culture does have one for. There's actually so much possibility for difference and for learning here. We should also note that when we're working with children and youth particularly, there's another factor to consider, and that's that in a lot of instances, children and youth don't always have the ability to dress themselves. For instance, they might not have the money to buy clothing or permission from their parents or caregivers to choose what to wear to school for themselves. That means that a lot of children or youth might have an interest in expressing gender in a particular way, but they might not actually be able to. And that's not even acknowledging the way that peer pressure might influence a student to dress a particular way just to blend in at school and not draw attention to themselves. So when we're thinking about gender expression, there's so much that we can talk about and discuss. But I think we've done a pretty good job of sort of getting just into it at the beginning here. So we're going to think a little bit more about some of the practical application of these pieces. So right now we're going to bring up a poll, and this is a question for you. In your experience, when do children generally start asking questions or talking about gender or assign sex? I don't mean in formal conversation or in curriculum. I just mean, when do they start talking about this? It could be at home, it could be in the hallway, it could be at recess, or connected in any way to gender or assigned sex. We see lots of folks chiming in here. So it looks like we have a pretty large group of people who have experienced this as a conversation that happens in junior kindergarten, and then others who have experienced it all the way up through through senior kindergarten through to grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and onward. So thank you for taking a second to share that with us. In our experience, this definitely aligns with a lot of the different science that's out there around student experience and children's experience of their gender identity and gender expression, and the way in which even at a really young age, like 3 or 4, there can be a kind of clear understanding of the social rules of gender identity and how to express gender. Even as children are also exploring their own understandings of these pieces of gender identity and gender expression. It doesn't mean that they're using that language, but we know that those concepts are being explored in a variety of different ways. And so we wanted to share that because it's really important to recognize that there are a whole array of formal opportunities within this curriculum to address gender identity and gender expression. But the reality is that these pieces are going to be coming up in the classroom from a very early time period, a very early age. And we saw many folks who have experienced this at a junior kindergarten level. once we realize how often gender expression and gender identity are being brought up within a classroom context and sort of within a broader community context, we can begin to consider how we can be inclusive of some of the diversity that we've talked about already in terms of gender identity and gender expression. So one simple suggestion that I had for you all was to think about asking the question, does this apply to 2S LGBTQI identities? And so to give you a little bit of an idea of how that might work, we can think about how this might work if there's a perspective within, a Strand D topic like the ones we've been talking about today, where we think that LGBTQ folks might not necessarily otherwise be included. So we've broken this down into 3 different areas. And up here, we have considerations of representation, of knowledge, and also of anti-stigma work. So for representation, we're thinking about all the different ways in which students and youth might encounter representations or media sort of images of 2S LGBTQI communities. We can think about how that might happen within a classroom environment and consider sharing the voices of 2S LGBTQI community. That could be through video resources, it could be through text resources, it could also be through guest speakers and community engagement. And that can also play out in representation within specific discussions. So for instance, in a discussion of something like pregnancy prevention, thinking of how to make sure that that discussion is inclusive of folks of a variety of gender identities, recognizing that it's not only going to be people who identify as women who themselves might be particularly experiencing pregnancy. And I know some folks are asking about grade level, so we're going to come back and talk about that in a second because we've got a couple of examples built in. When it comes to thinking about that knowledge piece, we can think about a whole bunch of different facts and information that are out there around 2S LGBTQ identities. So for instance, thinking about how we talk about sex as it's assigned at birth early on and recognizing the diversity that actually exists there. We can also think about how we talk about gender identity and some of those early discussions of gender, where often, you find children and youth really interested in categorizing people into the category of girl or boy, and maybe other children who aren't necessarily as interested in that process, and in reminding folks that there is a diversity of gender identity that is lived and experienced out there. We can also think about that anti-stigma piece and really acknowledge the long history that has existed of stereotypes and discrimination against 2S LGBTQI folks. So that means acknowledging the self-determination that we all have over our gender identity and recognizing that, some people's gender identity may be different than what we assumed or what we expected. And the important part is showing them respect for that self-identity, including, using pronouns that are correct or using the name that those folks ask us to use in conversation. So those are some of those broad pieces, but I know some folks in the chat are thinking specifically around what that might look like if we were to think about it within the curriculum as we know it for grades 1 through 6. And I want to emphasize again that what we're talking about here is an understanding of some of the opportunities that we have to apply our understanding of diversity as it comes to gender diversity in gender identity and gender expression to a whole bunch of conversations that aren't themselves formal discussions regarding gender identity and gender expression. But they also include a whole bunch of elements that overlap. So, for instance, we have highlighted here that grade 1 expectation D 1.3 to talk about body parts and recognizing that, lots of different body parts exist, and often those discussions exist within a model where we say girls have bodies that look like this and boys have bodies that look like this, but what we're really talking about is just the diversity of body parts that exist. So we can recognize that there might be some people who don't identify as girls that have certain body parts. There might be intersex folks, as we talked about before, who have body parts that might not be expected by their peers. And we can create a safe and welcoming environment by creating a discussion that is inclusive of a whole range of different gender identities and not just pointing towards a binary system that says all bodies of one gender or another have to look these ways. And as we start looking through these grade levels, we can see this applied in a number of different ways. So I've highlighted a bunch of other options for potential discussions here. And if these are pieces that you're concerned about, we can talk a little bit more about them. I know there's some folks in the chat who are bringing up some potential discussions around how these can be included. Again, I'm not talking about these as formal introductions within a curriculum discussion, but considering the ways in which we have these discussions to be inclusive of the diverse identities that already exist within our classroom environments. So for instance, in grade 3, when we're talking about healthy relationships, bullying, and consent, we can think about some of the different ways in which we navigate our relationships that can be inclusive of trans and intersex folks and their particular narratives. As we move forward into grade 4 and 5, we have discussions of puberty, and we're talking about changes that are emotional and social impact, and recognizing that for folks who identify as transgender or for folks who identify as intersex, there may actually be a whole range of different experiences in puberty that don't necessarily align with what the social expectations are for those individuals. So we can think about including intersex folks in discussions of puberty, including trans folks in discussions of the reproductive system. And that might be as simple as we talked about before, considering gender-neutral language, or not necessarily saying everyone who experiences menstruation has to identify as a girl. Or everyone who experiences the process of spermatogenesis has to identify as a boy. So there's some simple ways in which we can consider inclusive language to make sure that students in those classes who identify as intersex or trans or gender nonconforming or non-binary, a whole range of different identities can be included in those discussions as well. Obviously, then there are these particular pieces like grade 5, deep 2.4, where we have a formal discussion about a sexual orientation. So that offers one of those particular points in conversation where we can introduce and have a very direct conversation around a whole variety of different identities. We talked about gay and lesbian and bi. Those are some examples, including pansexual and agender. There's lots of different pieces there, and we can talk further. I can provide some resources in the blog, and there's some resources at the end of this presentation to speak specifically about those pieces. Lastly, if we look towards the middle school years and grades 7 and 8, we have opportunities to have some more direct conversations around gender identity, gender expression. So again, in D1.5, we have that formal introduction to ideas of trans identities, but also just a broader discussion of gender identity and gender expression. And here it's important to recognize that we're introducing formal language and a framework to understand topics that students are often engaged in discussion around since junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten. So we're offering these formalized and sometimes almost academic frameworks to understand a lived experience that many people will be quite familiar with. And so that is the spirit in which we've been looking at these different particular examples. And so given that, we wanted to have an opportunity for you all to think about some of the ways that you might contribute to these conversations. So we're going to do a chat activity here, which will involve 8 different chat windows representing grades 1 through 8. And you should see those coming online in front of you right now. So depending on the classrooms that you're working in or where you feel like you'd like to chime in most, we'd love to hear from you around some of the different experiences that you might have had in including discussions of diverse gender identities or gender expressions at different grade levels. So that can be, as I was talking about, examples of how to be inclusive in discussions of great body parts in grade 1, or be inclusive of a whole range of different experiences of puberty and the changes that people's bodies go through in grades 3 and 4. Or thinking about grade 5 and 6 discussions of sexual orientation, or discussions in grade 8 of gender identity and gender expression. Lots of different pieces here. We're going to give you a couple minutes in the chat. We'll be in there with you, both Tanya and myself, contributing if you've got any questions or pieces that you want to chat about further.
And Alyx and Tanya, just while we wait for folks to type away in the chat, I just wanted to highlight, too, that we do have additional resources on slides 32 and 33 that are sent out to all participants. And those include the Ministry of Education, so their resources, both the link to the curriculum as well as information for parents. So if folks haven't seen that before, the link is included in the slide deck that you've received. And we'll send that out again just so folks have it. And also the link to Growing Success, so the assessment and evaluation and reporting in Ontario schools. So that link is in the slide deck. And then as we had mentioned earlier, so the Ontario Association for the Support of Physical and Health Educators, or OPHEA, is on Twitter at SupportPHE. You can visit their website and learn more about what they have going on. And the OPHEA webinar series, so it wasn't just today's webinar, but there's been a whole series as well as recordings and registrations for upcoming webinars can all be found through ophea.net/webinars. And then another thing that did come up in the chat as we were going through the different grades was just some direct lesson plans. So if your school board has subscribed to the H&PE lesson plans on the teachingtools.ophea.net website, there are a plethora of lesson plans there that you can use. And throughout the school year, as we add new lesson plans, we will be putting a green box around those so those are identified. And then EGAL Canada can be a great source of additional resources, including their Support Your Gender Diverse Child, a guide to support parents, guardians, and caregivers resource, and their webinars and e-learning opportunities if you want to learn more through their website. So again, all those links are on the slide deck, and I'll pass it back to you, Alyx and Tanya. I see lots of stuff happening here in the chat.
Also, Kristen, maybe just want to mention that if folks have any links that they want to share in the chat, I know that there were a couple that popped up earlier that folks had posted, that those are always welcome to as extra resources if people are looking for some. I think I saw Teaching Sexuality that came up, which is I know is an Alberta resource that popped up in there. There's a number of different ones that if folks have that they're using in their bank of resources, if they want to share links to them, that's great as well.
So there were a lot of great ideas in the chat. If you didn't get a chance to put something in, please use the general chat in the bottom right hand of the screen. And we will be pulling out some of those ideas into our recap blog, so you have them handy for your implementation. And just as we finish up for the day, again, if you do have any resources that you're using, please share the link, the title, the name, all that good information so we can share that with one another. And we will be putting the link to all the resources that I had chatted through as well in the chat box. So we are moving into the last couple minutes of our time together. So this is our final question and answer period. So if you did have questions that you wanted to ask at this point for either Alyx or Tanya, or just for the general group, we can answer each other's questions for sure. Please do put those in the chat. And we're also just going to move into the last poll of the day. So just if you can fill out that poll and let us know how you're feeling at the end of this hour together. I know we did cover quite a lot of information, so I would encourage you to go back to the slides. And we will be sharing both the recording and the link to the recap blog once those are available. Kim, in terms of all the links, they are in the slide deck that you would have received as a webinar registrant, but we always include them in our follow-up recap blogs as well, just so they're handy in multiple spots. Tanya or Alyx, do either of you know of any specific resources for teaching students with special needs?
For teaching health for students with special needs?
I believe so, yes.
You know, I don't know of anything specific. I definitely have a couple of contacts that I can reach out to for that. But I haven't seen anything specific to teaching health for special needs.
Okay. So if we do come across anything, I do see that Nicole has shared teachingsexualhealth.ca, which has lesson plans for differing abilities. And thank you, Nicole, for putting the link in there. That's really helpful. So we'll be sure to include that link in the follow-up recap blog as well. All right, so I see some folks are signing off. So if you haven't had a chance to fill out the evaluation, please do so. We are definitely looking forward to your feedback. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all the participants for your thoughts, your ideas, your questions, as well as to our presenters. Thank you so much, Tanya and Alyx, for sharing your expertise and your time with us. We really appreciate it.